Does God exist? All my life I've wondered. I wish I could say I've progressed. I've assumed that the ultimate choice is between materialism, where only the physical is real, and theism, where God is the God of Abraham. Recently, philosopher friends suggest different ideas of God, not the personal creator of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They invite me to a special workshop on alternative concepts of God, where 15 or so philosophers of religion from across the globe, old friends among them, gather without audience or pretense. Here at the University of Birmingham in England, the workshop plans to challenge classical theism and to explore contrary concepts of God, some rather radical. I'm game, but skeptical. What are alternative concepts of God? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. Alternative concepts of God. I've always had God, if there is a God, in standard form. The most supreme being, the creator of the cosmos, with awareness, beliefs, intentions, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good. Am I too constrained by my culture? Should I try to break the shackles of tradition, free myself to think beyond? I need an overview, a framework, a grounding in theism, then a scan of the alternative landscape. I ask my host, the co-director of the workshop, philosopher Yujin Nagasawa. Yujin, we're friends, and I appreciate you feeling sorry for me in my battle between theism and atheism by inviting me to your conference on alternative concepts of God. But I worry that I'm just going to be overwhelmed. Can you give me some sense of the overview so I don't feel like a complete idiot?
Let's start with the classical concept of God. Mm-hmm. According to this concept, God is an omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect creator of the universe. And most classical theists are religious theists. So they think that God exists, so that's why they're theists. And also they are religious believers as well. So they think that there are some religious reasons to endorse theism. But there are other sorts of religious believers. So for example, there are religious atheists and religious agnostics. So they think that it's important to practice religion and go to the church and so on. And they think that the religion is socially and culturally and historically important. But at the same time, they don't take religious claims ontologically seriously. And I'd like to think that I'm one of these people, think that religion could be helpful, but that they don't have any religious commitment. But at the same time, they take theism seriously. So they think that there are philosophical or scientific arguments to show that God exists.
So now that we have this framework, where do some of these alternative concepts of God fit?
Okay, so let's consider pantheism. Pantheism says that God is identical to the universe. Yes. The universe is God. And this view is quite naturalistic. It doesn't say that God is something beyond the universe. So that's why many scientists like this view. And also there is panentheism as well. Panentheism says that the universe is not identical to God, but the universe is a proper part of God. That view is more similar to the classical concept of God, but still someone who is predisposed to naturalism might be attracted to this kind of view. Each position faces a problem of its own. So for example, consider the problem of evil. So the classical concept of God says that there is a morally perfect, all-powerful being. Then we wonder why there's evil in this world.
Sure.
But for example, pantheism faces a different kind of problem. So according to the Big Bang Theory, the universe began to exist about 15 billion years ago. But then that means that God began to exist 15 billion years ago. That's a little bit strange to think that God has an age.
So how important it is, do you think, for those who really want to understand the bedrock of reality to appreciate the spectrum of ideas about God?
Many people are attracted to theism, and I think there are good reasons for that. I mean, theism provides a reason for our existence, and arguably it explains why there is this world. But different forms of theism face different kinds of problems. So that's why we need to address them and see which version of theism is most plausible. And then we can compare the most plausible version of theism with naturalism and see which one provides a better worldview.
Yujin advises me to compare arguments for and against theism, naturalism, alternative concepts of God. He notes while alternative concepts are often more naturalistic than theism, every concept of God has its own problems. Most know that theism has the problem of evil, but who knew that pantheism has the problem of God having an age? Workshop attendees offer their philosophical fineries. Dig into why they believe, I remind myself. Don't get stuck on what they believe. I hear about what seems to be the rather primitive idea that God has a body. But the defender is a sophisticated professor of religious studies and theology at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, Marcel Sarot.
Traditionally, the Church has always held that God cannot suffer and cannot react in an emotional way to what happens in the world. Nowadays, many people think differently about this. They argue that God should be emotionally involved in what happens in the world, and that a God who is able to suffer with us and also to be happy with us is a better God, a more perfect God than a God who cannot react emotionally to what happens in the world.
So how do you go from there to God having a body?
One of the traditional arguments against the belief that God can suffer is that in order to suffer, you need a body. So suffering always brings some kind of feeling state with it. In order to feel something, you must be located. If God suffers, does that also mean the suffering of God is somehow located? And this is how I came to be involved in the position that God could be embodied.
Why is it important for God to suffer?
The most basic belief of Christians about God is that God is love. Now, love implies that you sympathize with the one whom you love. If God has a relationship of love with many people in the world, there are among those a lot of people who are in difficulties, who suffer, who are in pain. So real love will bring with it suffering for God.
So if you have God suffering and you need a body, I mean, tell me what that means. Does that mean God's extended in space?
Mm-hmm. In the early church, many of the church fathers discussed an analogy between soul and body on the one hand and God and the world on the other hand. Mm-hmm. They concluded from this that God was a disembodied spirit working in a material world. But you might just as well conclude that God is in some sense embodied in the world. And that's the metaphor that I developed in my work.
You say metaphor. There's a difference between a metaphor and a reality.
The idea that God is embodied in the world is a reality depicting metaphor. We don't know how to talk about this except for metaphors, but we do mean by these metaphors to talk about something real.
If one's theology requires God to suffer, perhaps it's not so outlandish to imagine ways in which God's pain or anguish is somewhere located. And so, yes, suffering does seem to be felt best with a body. But God having a body itself seems confused, anthropomorphic, naive. Does suffering need a body? The greatest anguishes are mental. God having a body does not crack my hard shell of skepticism. What might? Some philosophers are crafting a God that is naturalistic. Naturalistic God? That sounds contradictory. An oxymoron, like beyond infinity. Not so, says Professor Willem Drees, the editor-in-chief of Zygon, a leading journal of religion and science. Wim starts with science, then finds mystery.
Yeah, my view begins, I think, with accepting the scientific story. We have come to understand reality far deeper than we did centuries ago as humans. And part of it is that it shows an enormous integrity of reality. So an image of God up there in a very spatial sense, we don't have a place for that. So we are facing a question about how to think about ultimate reality. If you appreciate the scientific understanding, still you have questions remaining, kind of limit questions about the scientific understanding. Mm-hmm. Those may be the ultimate origin of everything or the ultimate origin of the laws of nature. I do have high respect for some colleagues who are very theistic and then appreciate science. And you might be more agnostic, talking about the mystery of existence in those terms, or also more immanent, as if the ground of existence is within reality. But still, that then you have this question where the ground of order has its roots.
In the latter category, that's moving more towards some of the pantheistic images where God is the world and the world is God. Do those images fit more closely with your understanding of a naturalistic kind of God?
Well, part of it for me is that you somehow seem to endorse everything as good, and there is some ambivalence as well. There's a lot of wonder about reality, appreciation of it, but in the pantheistic view, it seems all deified. There are two concerns for me in deifying reality. One is, what does it add? It seems pretty superfluous in just giving it another label, but saying, well, all of reality. And the other is also, well, in our reality as humans, we see things, evil or human sin, human failures. And so we also need the God language, I think, to differentiate morally between the positive and that which we want to criticize in the light of some higher ideal.
So you ground yourself in naturalism and science, and then look for some of these areas that science can't answer as the openness for where religion might flourish.
I think it has, for me, improved the understanding of the greatness of it all. It's much more than just an engineer making it. It's really the possibility of thinking, of wonder about why is there something rather than nothing, where does it all come from, is a very deep question, I think. It moves away from the old man with the beard to a more abstract, and for some, of course, then more far away, but maybe also more significant image.
The greatness of it all, that's what energizes me, compels me. I'd go with Wim, but I hesitate. If there is a God, why start with science? And if I do start with science, why end with theism? I'm told that John Bishop, a philosopher from New Zealand, would answer my questions with religious naturalism. But I'm warned, what I'd get would be neither natural nor religious.
I think the reason why people might find religious naturalism a contradiction is because they would think that if you say that God belongs within the natural world, right, they might think that you're reducing God to an ordinary object, the sort of thing that might be investigated by science, for example. And clearly that can't be a concept of God. God, everybody agrees that God isn't one of the things around hereabouts, you know. And that God really should not be some kind of mere item or aspect. Right. God has to be the creator of all. If you adopt the normal supernaturalistic view, you haven't gone far enough with that thought. Okay. You've still got God as an item, only you've, I think, invented this supernatural realm in which he operates somewhat anthropomorphically, as a supreme controller of everything, who set it all up in the first place for a good purpose and so on, but is in the end an intentional agent, rather like ourselves, although, of course, unique and uniquely supreme.
Okay.
And I think there is a tradition within classical theism where there is a strong repudiation of the idea that God could be any kind of an item at all. But then you say to yourself, well, that's very strange. If you say God isn't any kind of an item, what do you mean when you say that God exists?
Yeah.
If you're thinking that God exists in the sense in which other things exist, you haven't got a big enough God.
God is beyond categories, so God is beyond existence.
Yes. Now, at this point, there is a danger that one might just go, as they say, apophatic. Apophatic theology says that the most we can do is say what God is not. And it's out of that, actually, that you get the classical attributes of God. When they say God is atemporal, God is not in time. God is impassible, not the sort of thing that undergoes suffering or any kind of change, immutable. Now, of course, at this point, the atheist could turn around and say, now, wait a minute, God isn't anything at all. Right? So one does have to, even if you say God is not an item, not even a supernatural item, you have to be able to give some sort of positive account of what God is.
Okay, so how does religious naturalism do that?
A number of possibilities. One is pantheism, where you say, well, God isn't an item, but God is somehow the whole understood as a unity. My kind of religious naturalism focuses on the idea that there is a unity to the universe which has to do with its being directed upon a purpose that is supremely good. Why does the universe exist on this religious naturalist view? It exists for the sake of realizing the good. And of course, this naturalist conception of God has got rid of the idea of this rather anthropomorphized supreme person. And people very often react by saying, well, you've depersonalized God, What has happened to the possibility of a personal relationship with God? I would like to say I've transpersonalized God, that our personal existence is something obviously very important, but only an image of something even greater. And that's what we find in the nature of God.
John's religious naturalism seeks to do away with God as a supernatural being, not because the supernatural is too strange, but because it is not strange enough. If God exists just like other things exist, then the God you've got is a God too small. So if God cannot be a thing, an item, perhaps we can know nothing about God, or that God is the whole, a kind of pantheism. I'm transfixed by the insight that God is beyond categories. But I balk at removing personhood. Are there alternative concepts of God that perpetuate personhood? I encounter Eric Steinhart, a computer science-trained philosopher. When thinking about God, Eric thinks big, really big. Is he pulling my leg? Eric, you have a concept of God that is both non-traditional and exciting in its absolute bizarre nature. So tell me how your gods work.
Well, I think that there are infinitely many gods, and they're little g gods, not big G God. Right? Our world is just the physical world described by science. That's our universe. But our universe should be thought of as being generated by a little g God. So if you take the cosmological argument, which says there's going to be a necessary ground of the physicality of our universe, a necessary being that is the foundation of all the contingent things in our universe, that's our local God. And now you might ask, well, where did that come from? Well, what would you think would make a God, if not another God? So our God that made our universe was designed and created by a prior God, which of course has its own universe, and that was designed and created by an even prior God. And we run all the way back until we get to the simplest of all possible gods. And that first simple little God is a necessary being, an ultimate necessary being. It exists and is the root of the rest of this endlessly ramified tree.
Now, a typical theist would say that's a coherent argument, but you can eliminate all those intermediary steps. And you can just assume that the God of this universe is that primordial, simple, necessary being.
The traditional theists, they posit this God that's very complex. Now, they would like to say that it's metaphysically simple, but you know what? That doesn't work. I mean, our universe is complicated, and anything that could design our universe has to be a very complicated thing.
So your challenge is how am I going to build one? How can I get a complicated God? And I can't start with complicated.
Right.
I have to start with simple. So I have to have a process. Am I following along?
You are. It's an evolutionary idea. So gods evolve. Right, so the little gods beget bigger gods, and the bigger gods beget even bigger gods. The first God, the littlest God, is a first cause.
Okay.
You should think of it as like a little simple computer.
Right.
And it does just a few little things, and it can just generate a tiny little universe, maybe with a dot in it, or a point, with 0 dimensions. My idea is that you take a classical concept of perfection that just gives you this big one thing that's infinitely perfect. And I say that I don't understand if I understand if you go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you get up to infinity.
Yeah.
I don't understand just saying infinity. I'm trying to say that actually is good theology, to start out with a first simple cause, the little God that makes bigger gods.
And each one creates universes and other God offspring. So the two things that they do?
It's two things that they do in one sense, but in another sense, it's just really sort of one thing. I would like to think of universes as being sort of inside the God. It's not.
Okay.
It's more like the gods are minds, but what you've got is a God that's got a universe inside of itself, and so when it creates offspring of itself, sort of in its own image, they too will be things that have universes inside of themselves.
Right. So as you look at the whole scheme of a lot of little gods that are getting bigger and bigger, none of them ever reach the so-called big God that is of traditional theistic.
Right. That's our friend Pog.
Yeah.
The personal omni-God, right? So there's no Pog.
And ultimately, what are the advantages of having this basically infinite sequence of gods?
I avoid a lot of the problems of traditional theism. I can give a perfectly naturalistic account of creation and design. Right? For the traditional theist, it's a complete mystery how God designs and creates the world. I avoid, most importantly, the logical problem of evil.
Because your God is not all powerful, not all good.
Well, they're all good in a certain sense.
Not all good, not perfectly good.
Not perfect in that omni-good sense. That's right. And I can answer questions like, where does your God come from? I can say, well, it came from a simpler God.
But on that one, you lose, because you still have to have a primordial God that was a necessary being. The only difference you have a very simple God as the initial one.
That's right.
And I'm not sure if that's better or worse.
I think it's better. There's a contradiction here, right? Also a paradox for the traditional theists, the Pog people, that they want to say things like, well, their God is a simple first cause, but it's capable of designing things and it knows everything. Now, I don't understand how a simple thing can have knowledge of everything, or how a simple thing can be a person. So there is an advantage here, right? I've solved a problem that traditional theism, or Pog theism, can't solve.
Bewildering they are, so many kinds and variants of gods, if God is even the right term to use. Do we make progress? Do alternative concepts of God help discern ultimate explanations? Yes, I think, because we can see horizons farther, possibilities undreamt. God with a body, a naturalistic God, pantheism, the world is God, panentheism, the world is part of God. an infinite number of gods. I put the alternatives to philosopher Brian Leftow.
Whatever else God is supposed to be, he's supposed to be something you can pray to. But if the word God is just an empty name for a dead universe that can't hear you, then that's not really God.
I treasure alternative concepts of God, not because they explain reality, but because they enrich reality, because each in its own way highlights something of the ultimate. I myself still hold to a simple choice. Either there exists a personal-minded creator God, or brute fact naturalism is all there is. Yet there's more to know, getting closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com. This program was supported in part by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation.